just as I do. Welcome to episode 2 of Sorcery and Small Magics. So, let's see how far along we can get in today's video, and I hope that you enjoy it. Chapter 2. Chapter 2. Beginning my last year at the font with the blackened eye wasn't ideal. But at least it gave me an air of mystery, though I got several people looking at me curiously the next day. It wasn't until I was eating lunch in the refectory, book propped open in front of me, that anyone asked me about it outright. Your face looks like it. Did you walk into a door? This question was accompanied by Agnes Quest plopping herself down onto the bench beside me and stealing a piece of fruit from my plate. No, I said, lowering my book. I walked into Sebastian Grimm. Agnes's eyes widened, comically behind her gold-rimmed spectacles. You fought already, Leo? I told her the story of my evening, not bothering to hold back the details of my less than legal activities. Agnes didn't exactly support my lack of regard for rules, but she never condemned me for it either. Our lives have been intertwined since long before the fount. Through both the friendship and the politics of our parents, the member of people with a seat in the Citadel, Meandor's Department of Magical Governance, formed a very small circle, and their children an even smaller one, which meant Agnes and I shared near identical childhoods, full of high expectations and too many fancy parties. We had emerged from the experience bonded. This bond was cemented during the time after my mother's death, when I lived at her family estate for several months. We knew each other's best and worst qualities, and in general supported or forgave them. But this time, Agnes's forehead greased in a frown. I thought you were going to keep your head down this year. I wasn't even back on Fount's grounds yet, I protested. It was a last hurrah, a parting kiss with revelry before I commit myself to turning over a new leaf. You really needn't scold me. I prodded gingerly at the sore skin under my eye. Not when I've already paid for it. Her dark braids bounced as she shook her head at me. Well, it serves you right. Do you know how long it took for me to haul your luggage inside last night? The least you could have done was send along a charm to make this chest weigh less. Now hurry up. worse problems than a black eye if you make us late to duality. I closed my book without further prompting. The passage I'd been reading had focused on obscure words anyway, and I did my best to avoid those in my spells. Anything too obscure, and the magic might think I was actually trying to write something complicated, and that was a problem. The first time such a problem had occurred was when I was 11 and set fire to my tutor's beard. It would have been amusing if I'd intended for it to happen. It was a small fire, and he was an odious man. But that wasn't the case. And facial hair wasn't the only victim of my warped compositions. I wrote a spell meant to help my brother practice his sword forms, and he ended up with a broken collarbone. Agnes still had a tiny scar on her cheek from where one of my spells had exploded in her face. I nearly killed my cat trying to use magic to get him down from a tree. The list went on and on and on. Anytime I attempted to write grand magic, it twisted into something wrong in my hands. Depending on who you asked, I was either a menace or a waste of space. Neither option made casters particularly eager to test out my spells. Fortunately, Agnes had no such compunctions, and she was who I'd been paired up with for duality class. The seats were mostly taken by the time we got there. Grim was stationed at a table on the far side of the room, impossible to miss thanks to his purple hair. Excuse me. Grim was stationed at the table on the far side of the room, impossible to miss thanks to his pale hair and height. I had cleared view of the doorway, and I watched his eyes narrow and lips grow pinched as he noticed my arrival. "Don't start," Agnes muttered. He pulled me past Grim's table, farther into the high-ceilinged roof. I like everything at the fount. The lecture halls were beautiful, like an austere sort of a way. Marbled floors and dark wood-paneled walls offset by tall windows that lined one side of the room. Beyond the glass lay sprawling, sunny gardens, still flourishing in the last few weeks of summer. Agnes and I had just found our seats when, from the front of the room, there came the sound of her throat being cleared. Silence fell immediately. The few sorcerers not yet seated scurried to find their place as Sorcerer Fade rose from the desk, cane in hand. Fane had been at the fount longest out of all the instructors, and it showed in the wrinkles creasing their dark skin and the stark white of their hair. Fade was not the type of old that grew feeble. Instead, they had gathered their years around them like they assembled rings of a tree and used them to become formidable. The cane they carried was a souvenir from the same library break-in that had left the fount's security so heightened. Supposedly, Fate had arrived first on the scene and taken on the thieves single-handed. During our fourth tier, they had barely been able to walk at all, but now they simply moved with a pronounced limp. Scribers, please rise, Fate said in a carrying voice. Chairs scraped and feet shuffled as we compiled. There were fewer scribers than casters in the room, which was not uncommon. It's easy to test whether someone can cast magic, harder to tell if someone is capable of writing it. You need a scriber to impugn the words of a spell with magic. Otherwise, it was just ink on paper. But even someone who did have the gift for scribing still needed to use the old language to write spells. And not everyone learned it as a child. Gentry families like my own usually passed the language on or hired tutors to do so. But if you weren't born into a family of sorcerers, your chances of learning it were small. As a result, plenty of scribers were unnoticed and untrained. To make up the difference, some of the tables in the room housed groups of multiple casters working with a single scriber, while a few of us remained in pairs. This was similar to how the disparity was dealt with in the coterie, where sorcerers usually worked together in troops, but occasionally operated as a duo. Fate's eyes flickered over us, face stern and remote in a way that reminded me of Grimm. Rumor had it Fate was the one who had nominated Grimm for admittance into the fount when he was discovered as a child. I'd often wondered if this early association was to blame for Grimm's character. Perhaps he'd imprinted on Fate like a baby duckling and decided to emulate their forbidding nature. Fate began to walk down the line of tables, cane tapping lightly, and as they walked, they spoke. For the past 4 years, I've endeavored, to reach I can't read. Only sat there, straight-backed, looking deeply displeased. This close, I noticed Grimm's sash was held together by a neat line of stitches. He had obviously gone to the great effort and make the stitches as careful and as small as possible. But the bearer still stood out, like a stain on a white shirt. Perhaps I should have felt a glimmer of remorse. Instead, all I felt was a savage sort of glee at witnessing the blemish on his otherwise perfect image, knowing I put it there. Once partners had been assigned, the scribers were instructed to choose one of the spells we'd written over break for our new partner to cast. My offerings were slightly more intricate than usual, given that I'd had all summer to devote to their making, but they were still only charms and cantrips, nothing that would be a stretch for any caster in the room. Yet, similar to the night before, Grimm spent an inordinate amount of time studying the spell I handed him. In fact, he took so long looking at it that many of the other sorcerers finished casting before we had even begun. I watched the of sight as her partner recited a lackluster invisibility spell. Across the rooms, a spell meant to freeze someone in place went wrong and left broken bits of ice melting on the floor. The scriber of that spell swore as Fade pursed his lips at the mess. Many different grand magic spells were being tested with varying levels of success, but the most ambitious one by far was cast by Agnes. I looked over at her table just as the spell in her hand finished burning away, and Cassius' form shimmered and began to wiggle and shake like jelly. It was both uncomfortable and fascinating to watch. But after only a few seconds of this display, Cassius disappeared altogether, replaced by a small brown sparrow. The spell lasted less than a minute, but this was still very impressive. Successful transformation spells were rare. A pretty part of me, a petty part of me, couldn't help but to notice that Cassius didn't quite dare test out his own wings. My spells had been small, but they were fully functional. Grim cleared his throat pointedly, and I turned back round to face him as we begun casting. Great tendrils of smoke drifted up from his hands. The windows in the room were all cracked open, but I knew my hair would smell like fire for the rest of the day, at least. Once the paper was gone, Grim brushed his ash from his hands, unfazed. Not for the first time, I wondered what it would be like to have that kind of power at your disposal. Scribers don't cast, or at least we can't cast anything that requires more than a thimbleful of magic. It was dangerous to try for anything more than that. Bite your cheek, feel the softness against your teeth as you bear down. Press to the point of skin breaking. You could keep going, but why would you? There's a line there, between pressure and pain. No one needs to tell you where it is, but you can feel it all for yourself. That's casting a spell. I don't know exactly what Grim felt, but wherever that point lay for him, it was far past anything I could ever imagine. Grim frowned. Your spell did not work. He looked over at me, clearly confused. What does it mean to you? It warms your clothes so that you never have to put on a cold sock or cold anything. Really, I probably should have just taken something off for you and cast it on, though. It was already sweating. Grim looked around the room as Cassius, who had been marveling with Agnes over the fact that his bird form had left behind a downy feather on the bench, and the woman who appeared to be holding a very tiny lightning bolt in her hand. But when partners were too busy of cleaning up the puddle on the floor, then he looked back at me. I see, he said. Those two little words, spoken with such cold formality, managed to convey far more than if Grim had twice as much. It was the verbal equivalent of someone looking down their nose at you. He had been keeping an especially close watch on our table for the duration of his class, so I could not respond as I wished to. but I resolved then and there is only give. Grim spells I knew he would hate for the remainder of our partnership. I would smother him with cosmetic charms and brink cantrips. I would give him exactly what he asked for, and nothing more. I didn't linger over this choice at the time, but in hindsight, I think it would have sealed our fate. This one plan, petty decision, not so different from others I had made before, all because I couldn't stand the way Grim looked at me. I did not add to it despite him, but really, I've always been my own worst enemy. Wow, 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 wow. That was a pretty good chapter. Stay tuned. Next chapter is coming out real soon. Thank you, Mivita. I appreciate you and love you so much.